Imagine a world where the human body no longer aged. A world where the clock that ticks inside every cell, the inevitable decline of skin, organs, muscles, and neurons simply stopped. You hit your prime, whatever you define as prime, and stay there. Forever. Science has finally cracked the code of aging at the molecular level: telomere shortening, mitochondrial decline, stem cell exhaustion, all neutralized. You could live to 200, 500, maybe 1,000 years, and never look or feel a day older. It sounds like paradise, right? But let's not fool ourselves. The consequences of such a discovery would shatter society more violently than any war, revolution, or pandemic ever could. Because the world built on the assumption of aging would collapse overnight. The first turning point comes the day after the announcement. People don't celebrate quietly, they panic. If immortality, or even just biological stasis, is real, who controls it? Is it free, or only for the elite? Already, you see the fracture lines. Governments scramble to classify the treatment as a state secret. Billionaires throw their fortunes into biotech firms. Religious leaders call it blasphemy. And ordinary people? They riot, desperate not to be left behind. Now imagine hospitals worldwide. Suddenly, cancer is no longer a death sentence. Alzheimer's, heart disease, organ failure, all obsolete. Entire medical industries implode within months. Think of the pharmaceutical giants whose profits depend on selling pills for chronic illness. Their stocks crash, and so do the pensions tied to them. Hundreds of thousands of jobs disappear, not because people are sick, but because they're not. The system we built around human fragility crumbles. But the real shock comes when the army and police get involved. Militaries don't think about morality, they think about advantage. An immortal soldier doesn't just survive longer, he accumulates centuries of combat experience. A police officer who never retires becomes a walking archive of criminal tactics. The balance of power shifts not to the largest military, but to the one that controls the treatment. Imagine a country where generals never age out, where secret agents can spend 80 years embedded without anyone noticing. Eternal youth becomes the most terrifying weapon ever invented. Religion reacts violently. For thousands of years, faith has promised life after death, peace beyond the grave. What happens when death itself disappears? Do people abandon religion? Some will, but others will double down, calling the treatment a tool of the devil, a temptation worse than sin. You'd see holy wars erupt, not over land or doctrine, but over who dares to reject the gift of mortality. Churches would fracture. Mosques, temples, synagogues, all forced to answer the same question: if we stop aging, do we stop needing God? And don't forget family life. If nobody grows old, what happens to generations? Parents remain the same age as their children after a certain point. Imagine a 200-year-old father who looks 35, standing beside his 170-year-old son who also looks 35. Who is the authority then? Families are built on the cycle of birth, growth, and death. Without it, the very structure collapses. Marriage vows of "till death do us part" suddenly mean forever, literally. Divorce rates would skyrocket. And children? Would anyone even want them, if the world is already overflowing with undying adults? Population growth becomes the single greatest threat. Earth already struggles with 8 billion. What happens when no one dies? Cities burst at the seams. Food, water, and housing vanish in months. Governments are forced into the darkest policies imaginable: strict birth bans, forced sterilization, even culling. Yes, culling. Because in a world without death, killing might become the only form of population control. Wars wouldn't just be fought over resources but also as population release valves. Immortality doesn't erase human violence, it amplifies it. And here's the darkest truth: not everyone gets immortality. Even if the science exists, there will always be scarcity, inequality, corruption. The rich and powerful would seize it first, securing eternal youth for themselves while the poor rot in the same aging bodies. Imagine politicians who never step down, dictators who rule for centuries, CEOs who dominate entire industries for 500 years. The hierarchy we complain about today would solidify into an eternal caste system. The rich wouldn't just be richer, they'd be immortal. So, ask yourself, is stopping aging really salvation, or is it the final trap of civilization? Imagine your boss never retiring, your oppressors never dying, your mistakes never fading into history. Imagine a future where death doesn't free us, but enslaves us to the living. And if you've made it this far, you see how dangerous and fascinating this idea truly is. So before we dive into the next stage, the psychological consequences of never aging, make sure to subscribe. Because trust me, you're not going to want to miss what comes next. Now let's dive deeper into what immortality really does, not to governments or armies, but to the human mind. Because while science may stop the aging of our bodies, it cannot stop the weight of endless time pressing down on us. The psychological consequences would be far worse than anything physical. At first, people would celebrate. Who wouldn't? No more wrinkles, no more aching joints, no more fear of death. But euphoria fades, and when it does, the mental spiral begins. If life never ends, what gives it meaning? Right now, our goals, our ambitions, even our art are fueled by urgency. We know our time is limited, so we strive, we push, we create before it's too late. Take away the deadline, and suddenly everything feels pointless. Write a book. You have infinite time. Start a business. You can always do it later. Human drive collapses under the weight of eternity. Depression would skyrocket. We already know from psychology that too much choice, too much freedom, overwhelms people. Now imagine infinite choice stretched over centuries. Suicide might become more common than natural death ever was, because for many, ending life would be the only way to escape its endlessness. The irony, a cure for aging might not lead to eternal life, but to more people choosing eternal death. Relationships collapse under the same pressure. Today, falling in love feels precious because it's fleeting. You get one shot, maybe two or three, and then your time runs out. But if you're immortal, how do you commit? Forever stops being poetic and becomes terrifying. Divorce lawyers would become the busiest professionals on earth. Couples would burn through dozens, even hundreds of relationships, cycling through partners as quickly as they get bored. And with each breakup, more cynicism, more emptiness. Love might not disappear, but it would cheapen into something disposable, because nothing is scarce anymore, not even time with another human being. Culture itself would stagnate. Right now, every new generation replaces the old, bringing new ideas, new music, new politics. That churn keeps society alive. But what if nobody ages out? What if 300-year-old politicians still cling to power, 400-year-old artists refuse to step aside, 500-year-old professors teach the same dogma forever? Innovation dies. Society calcifies. The young, if governments even allow young people to exist, would have no space to rise. History wouldn't progress, it would freeze. Eternal life doesn't mean eternal growth. It means eternal stasis. Education would be turned upside down. If you can live forever, do you even bother learning in your 20s? Or do you postpone it endlessly? Imagine students spending 50 years in school, 100 years training for a career, then abandoning it after a decade because they got bored. Industries would be flooded with eternal amateurs hopping from skill to skill without ever moving on. The concept of expertise, of mastery, would blur into meaninglessness when anyone can eventually dabble in everything. Even art loses its soul. The greatest works of literature, music, and painting were born from the confrontation with mortality. Shakespeare's sonnets about time and death. Beethoven writing as he went deaf. Van Gogh's desperate rush to paint before his life collapsed. Without mortality, what does art have to say? An immortal artist might produce millions of works, but would any of them matter if none of them carry urgency? When nothing ends, nothing is precious. Religion, too, faces its deepest crisis here. Forget about institutions, think about individuals. For centuries, people endured suffering because they believed in a reward after death. Heaven, reincarnation, nirvana, some final chapter. But if there is no end, no afterlife, what do you do with eternity? Faith might mutate into bizarre new cults. Some would worship death as the last sacred act. Others would form suicide sects, rejecting immortality as false salvation. And still others would insist that by cheating death, humanity has declared itself God. But gods with boredom, jealousy, and cruelty. Not divine at all, just immortal animals. Crime also transforms. If nobody ages, long prison sentences become meaningless. Lock someone away for 50 years. That's nothing. For a murderer who lives 600 years, even life without parole is just another kind of immortality. The justice system collapses under the weight of time. What punishment could possibly fit? Executions might return, not as cruelty, but as the only meaningful sentence left. In an immortal society, death itself becomes the rarest, most valuable currency. Here's the bitter truth: immortality sounds like freedom, but it might become the heaviest chain ever forged. Because without death, there is no urgency, no renewal, no escape. Just an endless loop of politics, relationships, and boredom stretching across centuries. The body may not decay, but the mind? The mind will rot under the weight of forever. And we're not done yet. Because while psychology crumbles, economics and power would mutate into something far more dangerous. Who owns the future when no one dies? Who controls wealth when fortunes never pass on? If psychology collapses under the weight of eternity, then economics burns to the ground. Because aging isn't just a biological process, it's the foundation of how wealth, power, and opportunity circulate in our world. Take death out of the equation, and the system freezes in a way that is catastrophic for anyone not already at the top. Start with inheritance. Right now, fortunes move down the chain when people die. Billionaires pass their empires to children, landowners eventually release their grip, industries shift as old bosses retire. That cycle allows wealth to be redistributed, imperfectly, but at least it moves. Immortality stops all of it. Imagine a billionaire who never dies, a dynasty that never breaks. Trillions of dollars locked up forever in the hands of a few individuals who get to control everything, indefinitely. The middle class, the working class, they never rise, because the ladder has been sawed off at the top. And it's not just money. Power itself gets trapped. Think of politicians. We complain now when someone stays in office for 20 or 30 years. What about 200 years? What about 500? Dictatorships would become eternal, literally. Democracy depends on turnover, on new blood pushing out the old. But without death, leaders never leave unless forced out. And with immortality, they'd have centuries to entrench themselves, to build surveillance states, to crush resistance before it even begins. The idea of political progress vanishes. Revolutions become impossible against leaders who cannot die. Now picture corporations. CEOs today stay in charge for decades at most before age forces retirement. In a deathless world, there is no retirement. Tech giants, oil barons, banking dynasties, they'd monopolize industries forever. No new competitors, no startups rising to dethrone them, because the same people who built the system are still running it centuries later. Capitalism thrives on creative destruction, old players failing, new ones rising. Without death, capitalism itself fossilizes. Eternal monopolies. Permanent oligarchies. Labor markets implode as well. Jobs only exist because older workers eventually step aside. But what if they never do? Imagine being 25, looking for work in a world where 60-year-olds still hold every position, and now they'll hold them forever. No promotions, no vacancies, no generational shift. The youth would be permanently locked out of opportunity, forced into menial labor or rebellion. It's not just unfair, it's explosive. Societies would fracture into the immortal haves and the expendable have-nots. Housing becomes another nightmare. Right now, people inherit houses when parents or grandparents pass away. Land circulates, freeing up space for younger families. But what if nobody dies? Real estate locks up forever. Cities choke with immortal residents who never move, never downsize, never leave. Housing crises turn into permanent disasters. Skyscrapers filled with eternal tenants, slums filled with the unlucky masses who never got access to the treatment. The gap between rich and poor stretches into infinity. And then comes the military-industrial complex. Immortal generals, immortal defense contractors, immortal armies with centuries of training. Wars wouldn't just be fought for resources, they'd be fought for control over who gets the treatment. If only one nation holds it, every other nation is doomed to fall behind, ruled forever by the undying elite. If it spreads globally, then wars erupt over territory, because no one dies to balance populations. And remember, the wealthy will hoard immortality while the poor are sent to fight. Eternal wars, endless soldiers. But there's another problem, one few people consider: debt. Today, debt has meaning because lives are finite. You borrow for a house, you pay it off in 30 years. Banks calculate interest on the assumption that you'll eventually die. But immortality destroys that system. Imagine debt stretching over 200 years, compounding interest until you owe not thousands, not millions, but billions. Or flip it, imagine lenders exploiting their own immortality, holding generations hostage with contracts no human can escape. Debt slavery would become eternal slavery. Even crime takes on new dimensions. Mafia bosses, cartel leaders, warlords, they no longer die. They build networks that last centuries, refining corruption until it's unbreakable. Imagine a drug cartel run by the same man for 400 years, learning every weakness of law enforcement, bribing not one generation of politicians but 10. Crime would no longer be chaotic, it would become institutionalized, permanent, unbeatable. So what happens? The world splits into castes. On one side, the immortals, the wealthy, the powerful, the untouchable. On the other, the mortals, or worse, the deliberately excluded. Imagine being part of the underclass, watching your boss, your landlord, your president remain the same age decade after decade, while you wither. That resentment wouldn't fade, it would explode. And revolutions wouldn't be about money anymore. They'd be about access to eternity. The irony is brutal. Immortality was supposed to free humanity, but in practice, it enslaves it to those who get it first. And those who don't? They'll spend their short lives staring at the eternally young faces of their rulers, knowing they were locked out of paradise. If you think that's dark, wait until we confront the next stage, how immortality changes violence, war, policing, and the very concept of justice. Because when no one dies naturally, killing becomes the only real power left. Now let's turn to the most dangerous shift of all, how immortality would transform war, policing, and justice. Because if natural death disappears, then killing becomes the only true power left. And history tells us this: when humans are given a new tool of power, they use it. Think of the military first. An immortal soldier isn't just someone who can fight forever, they're someone who carries centuries of combat knowledge. Today, armies rotate personnel, train new recruits, and retire veterans. That churn creates fresh perspectives but also limits experience. With immortality, you'd have warriors who fought in dozens of wars across centuries. Elite soldiers wouldn't just be skilled, they'd be unbeatable legends. Special forces operatives would become walking war machines, knowing every trick, every tactic, every human weakness. Wars would no longer be short bursts of conflict. They would drag on for centuries, fought by the same soldiers who never die. Imagine a general with 400 years of battlefield experience planning your destruction. And the police? The consequences are even darker. Picture officers who never retire, who know every neighborhood, every gang, every criminal family, because they've been policing them for generations. That sounds effective, but it also means absolute power. Police brutality would take on a new dimension when the same officers enforce laws for centuries without accountability. Oversight fails when the overseers never change. The police state becomes permanent, eternal, inescapable. An immortal enforcer doesn't just maintain order, they define it for eternity. Now let's think about justice. Punishment today is based on time, 10 years, 20 years, life. But when life has no end, what does a prison sentence mean? Imagine sentencing someone to 50 years, knowing it's nothing more than a pause in their endless existence. For the truly dangerous, murderers, rapists, war criminals, the system breaks. Society would be forced into a cruel choice: either keep people locked up forever, or kill them. Execution would return, not as barbarism, but as necessity. In a world without aging, death itself becomes the only punishment with weight. And that realization makes violence far more common. Right now, many conflicts end simply because time runs out. Oppressors die, revolutions outlast tyrants, injustices fade as generations change. Remove death, and injustice lasts forever. The oppressed can no longer wait out their oppressors, they must kill them. Violence becomes the only form of progress. Revolutions wouldn't be rare, they'd be constant, because assassination is the only way to change the system. But don't think only of organized war. Crime itself mutates. Imagine gangs whose leaders never die, passing knowledge and power down not to successors, but to themselves. They become immortal kings of the underworld. Law enforcement can't dismantle them, because the same figures resurface again and again, armed with centuries of experience. Corruption hardens. Entire cities could fall under the eternal rule of immortal crime bosses. Religious violence would also intensify. If faiths split over whether immortality is sacred or blasphemous, those conflicts wouldn't burn out after a generation. They'd continue for centuries, fought by the same zealots who never age. Imagine a crusader, a jihadist, a militant monk who never dies, still fighting the same holy war 300 years later. Peace talks and treaties mean nothing if the combatants are immortal fanatics. And then there's terrorism. The very idea of martyrdom changes when life is endless. Some might view death as the ultimate rebellion in a world where nobody dies naturally. Suicide bombings, once rare, might become widespread, because in a society addicted to immortality, choosing death becomes the loudest protest imaginable. Others might target immortality infrastructure, labs, clinics, government vaults, turning them into high-value targets. Wars of ideology and desperation would make 20th-century terrorism look like child's play. But here's the most disturbing possibility: immortality itself becomes a weapon. Imagine governments using it selectively, granting eternal youth to loyal soldiers, while denying it to rebels. Imagine criminal syndicates charging millions for stolen treatments, selling eternity on the black market. Imagine police forces offering it to informants as the ultimate plea bargain: betray your friends, and live forever. Immortality wouldn't just be medicine, it would be leverage, the sharpest knife in the arsenal of power. All of this leads to one chilling conclusion: if natural death disappears, killing doesn't stop, it becomes more important than ever. Because immortality doesn't erase violence, it concentrates it. The entire world becomes a battlefield where the only real stakes are life versus death. And in such a world, mercy vanishes. Compassion vanishes. What's left is survival, sharpened to its cruelest edge. But we're still not finished. Because if you think war and violence are terrifying under immortality, wait until you see what happens to culture, meaning, and the human spirit itself after centuries of endless life. We've seen how immortality destroys economics, politics, war, and justice. But the deepest wound cuts through culture, meaning, and the human spirit. Because even if science solves aging, it cannot solve purpose. And a humanity without purpose is more terrifying than any dictator or army. Think of culture first. Right now, art, music, literature, film, these are fueled by urgency. People create because time is running out, because mortality forces expression. Immortality takes that away. Without death, art risks becoming endless but hollow, infinite but meaningless. Imagine a musician releasing their comeback album every decade for 400 years. Imagine actors who never age, dominating cinema forever, their faces frozen in time while new talent never rises. Culture stagnates, not because people lose skill, but because they lose urgency. And what survives isn't greatness, it's repetition. The 22nd century might still be obsessed with the same stars of the 21st, simply because they never went away. Sports collapse too. Today's excitement comes from records being broken, limits being pushed, legends rising and falling. But what happens when the same athlete competes for 200 years? They refine their body endlessly, learning every technique, shattering every record until the competition is meaningless. Imagine a world where one sprinter, one boxer, one soccer player dominates for centuries. The thrill vanishes. Why watch when the outcome is always the same? Religion mutates into something unrecognizable. Faiths built on the promise of life after death lose their foundation. Some believers abandon religion entirely, turning instead to nihilism or cults that glorify mortality. Others radicalize, framing immortality as the ultimate sin. Entire new religions might emerge, worshipping death itself, treating suicide as holy. Humanity doesn't become godlike, it becomes spiritually fractured, lost between eternal life and eternal emptiness. And what of family? Already in part 1 we saw how generations collapse. But go further, what happens to parenting when there's no urgency to reproduce, no natural turnover? Birth rates would plummet. For many, children would seem unnecessary, even reckless, in a world already choking on immortals. The bond between parent and child weakens when parents never fade. Imagine being a child in a world where your parents never grow old, never die, where they're not guides preparing you for the future, but eternal roommates, locked in the same age forever. Family ceases to be a cycle, it becomes an endless loop. And society as a whole? It freezes. History stops moving forward. Inventions slow to a crawl because the old refuse to step aside. Political ideologies never die, no matter how outdated. Cultural debates drag on forever, with the same voices repeating the same arguments century after century. Humanity becomes stuck, not because we lack intelligence, but because immortality kills the reset button. Death has always been the engine of progress, without it, civilization stalls. Here's the paradox, humans crave immortality because we fear death. But without death, life loses its frame. A painting without edges is just a smear of color. A song without an ending is just noise. Life without death is not life, it's existence, stretched thin, stripped of urgency, stripped of meaning. And so the final consequence emerges, humanity splits not into rich and poor, not into immortal and mortal, but into those who choose eternity and those who reject it. Because for many, death will become not the enemy, but the last act of freedom. Suicide, once seen as tragedy, might be redefined as liberation, the only way to reclaim meaning in an endless world. In the end, the cure for aging doesn't erase death. It forces us to confront it in ways darker than ever before. So here's the ultimate question, would you take immortality if it were offered to you? Would you embrace the endless years, knowing the cost is meaning itself? Or would you choose death, not as an enemy, but as the final boundary that gives life its beauty? Drop your answer in the comments, and more importantly, suggest the next radical, what if, topic we should tear apart. Because the conversation doesn't end here, it only begins.